The ancient Greeks gave us some gifts that we are still using today. Now, whenever we are talking about gifts from ancient Greece, we are actually going to use the word contribution. A contribution is an act of giving or doing something that improves a situation. So if you think about it as if you were going to a party, if you brought something to that party, the person there may say, "Thank you for your contribution," because you brought something to improve that situation. Sometimes a contribution is something that you can touch, and sometimes it's not. It's more of an idea. So today we're going to be talking about the architectural contributions that we received from ancient Greece that we're still using today and are still evident in our everyday lives. Today we're talking about columns. A column is a way to support a roof system. So the ancient Greeks would use these in their architecture as support for the roof, but they also wanted it to look nice as well. So today we're going to talk about 3 types of columns that we are still using in our architecture, and they have 3 different names and 3 different looks. So it's our job to remember the names and remember what they look like. The 3 types of columns are the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian column. And so since it's important for us to know the difference, we're going to talk about some ways to remember the names and how to distinguish between the 3. The first one that we're going to talk about is my favorite, which is the Ionic column. The sides of the Ionic column kind of look like they're swirly. It actually is supposed to look like a scroll. If you would take a paper and roll it up on both sides, that would be a scroll. But the way that I was taught to remember this way back when I was in 6th grade is if you think about those swirls looking like some crazy eyes, that's an Ionic column. So it's kind of like a funny way for you to remember when you look at that the eyes on the sides go along with the Ionic column. The next one is a Corinthian column, and it's probably the most decorative and fancy type of column that there is. They're not all this fancy as the one that's in this picture, but a lot of times they are going to be the most ornate and have a lot of details in there. And the way that I was always taught to remember this is it's so fancy and it looks like a fancy crown. So if you think about Corinthian, crown, they kind of sound a little bit similar. They both start with a C. And so if you think about somebody wearing this fancy Corinthian crown on her head or his head, that can help you remember that one. The last one is a Doric column. This is probably my least favorite, and it's plain. It's not as exciting. So what I always think about is if we would change this D and make it a B and add an I and G. These are the boring columns. They're the Doric boring columns. They of course have their purpose, and they are probably the most common type of column that you will see wherever you see that. You can find these types of columns all around. For instance, if you travel to Washington, D.C. and check out the Lincoln Memorial, you'll see that the Lincoln Memorial has a lot of columns all the way around it. In fact, the Lincoln Memorial looks a lot like a Greek temple that you could see if you traveled to Greece today. Here is the Capitol building in Richmond, Virginia. So right here in Virginia, we have some columns, and like I said, those were ideas taken directly from the ancient Greeks. And the last example here that I have for us today is Monticello, which is where Thomas Jefferson lived. And you'll notice that in the front there are some big Doric columns.